This lesson is going to be a lot of fun because we really get to get into the details of working with painting and drawing tools. We're going to start working with the pencil tool, and for the pencil you do not need a fill. Just choose a stroke color that makes you happy. So how about if we work with red, and we'll grab our pencil tool and just click and drag and draw a line. And you'll notice that the line has some anchor points which represent the beginnings or ends of any curves or changes in the shapes. And those were automatically placed down for me. All I really had to do was draw my squiggle. Now you notice that the cursor has a little X on its end. If you click and drag, you can create a new path. Even though this path is selected, anytime that X is visible, I can click and drag and create a new path. However, if I put my cursor close enough to an existing selected path, you'll notice that the X disappears. This means that I could continue drawing even if I don't click right on that path point. That path will continue drawing in that shape that I drew. So there's my X disappearing, continuing to draw like so. So you can extend any selected path even if you already moved away from it. Just reselect it, grab your pencil tool, wait for that X to disappear, and start drawing. Now paths can be open or closed shapes. So there's my X disappearing. I could come right around here like so and draw right on top. And you could usually tell if your shape is closed because it has a bounding box around it. You could also try to fill your shape to see if the shape is closed like so. So let's undo. I'm going to delete that one and delete these guys. And we'll draw another path like so. Now while you're drawing, another way that you can close your shape is before you release your mouse, is hold down the Alter option and notice that that X turns into a little zero, a little hollow O. When you release your mouse, that will close the shape for you automatically. So that's one of those handy reminder keyboard shortcuts that you may want to remember. And it doesn't matter where you are on the artboard, Alter option converts the pencil tool and will close that shape with a straight line. Now once you have your shape, you're not stuck with it. Using the pencil tool, as long as your shape is selected and you start drawing on the path, you can continue drawing or redraw any existing shape. That's pretty handy. One thing I love to do is when you're working with primitive shapes, for instance, is that you don't have to stay with the perfectly crisp, perfectly aligned shape that you're working with. You can use your pencil tool to redraw part of it and give it a little bit more of an organic feel. Sort of using the original as a guide, but then moving away from it. Now, another tool underneath the pencil tool is something called the smooth tool. And this is almost like taking your fingers on a piece of string or something that's been sort of crumbled or crinkled, and then running your fingers across it to try and smooth it out. So you'll draw on top of the line. You're not actually drawing a new line, but you're just trying to smooth it out. You're sort of showing the line where you want it to go, or even telling, rather, the line you want to simplify and smooth. And simplifying the line actually will, in most cases, remove anchor points for you and give you a cleaner, smoother looking shape, like so. Then underneath that is the Path Eraser tool. And with the Path Eraser tool, you can actually erase little segments of your selected path. After you erase, those segments are often still selected until you continue erasing. You'll notice that each one successively was deselected as I continued to erase on one of the selections. So you can use that Erase Path tool on any shape. Let's put it back to the regular pencil. Now, paintbrushes work in a slightly different way. So there's my paintbrush tool, and we'll paint with a different color. Move down a little bit. With your paintbrush tool, you just start clicking and painting. Actually, it didn't grab my color. Let's go here and do this again. There we go. And depending on which brush that you have selected, that's going to determine the shape of your mark on the artboard. If you double-click on the paintbrush tool, you can see the paintbrush tool options. Here you can modify the fidelity and smoothness of your brush, as well as some options such as keeping the fill new brush strokes, so you can have brush strokes be filled with color. You could keep them selected after you release the path, though the default is to, once you let go of your mouse, you let go of the path. Work whichever way you like. You can also edit selected paths, and then you could specify edit within a specific pixel range and click OK once you've made modifications. But I think even more instructive is if you go to the brushes panel. There's a whole panel set for just paintbrushes, which is amazing. The default brush is this one here. It's a 2-point oval brush. If you wanted to modify the brush head, you can select any of these other presets. So this one is a little bit wider of a brush compared to the original. And what I usually recommend is that new people go through each of these and do what I'm doing. Just see what each of these brush heads can do for you so that you start to learn which ones do which. Now, there are also several brush profiles that you can choose from, and they will also create different brush looks for you. So this one looks like charcoal. So it's giving you sort of a charcoal edge on your line. This next one is a tapered stroke. So it starts off tapered, it gets fat in the middle, and then it ends tapered. There are several other brush options here. This one actually uses artwork to create a shape. And this next one uses artwork. And we're going to talk about all these different brush types. But look at this one uses this little segment to create a path, and then it has a special endpoint to create the arrow. Here's another one for creating borders. So if you're creating straight paths, you get something like this. But if you were to create borders, you could get even these little flourishes around the corners. There are several brush libraries that come free with Adobe Illustrator, and I encourage you to go check them out. You can access your brush libraries through the Library button at the bottom of the Brushes panel. There are arrows, artistic, borders, bristle brushes, decorative brushes, vector packs, and you can download tons and tons of really awesome vector packs from online. So go looking for those, and you can just easily install them in your copy of Illustrator. If you're using a Wacom tablet, you can install and use these 6D brushes. If you don't have a Wacom or a graphics tablet, these are sort of irrelevant for you because a tablet and a pen like that is pressure sensitive. You could probably pick one up for about $99 if you were interested in getting something like that. And then if you wanted to, you can open up other libraries, such as something that you grab from online, or you could create your own libraries from your own artwork. Let's open up Artistic, and we'll look at ink. So these ink options, and let's change our brush color so that we can see what's going on top of them. So there's this splatter ink drop. So you could just click to add it, or you can click and paint with it and you create scattered splops. So all these are sort of these scatter sploppy ink drop splatters. Here's another one, and usually you put your cursor on top of it and you can see the name of it, which will sort of clue you into how it's going to look once you click and drag. And this usually gives you a good idea of what the end will look like. And notice though, even though I have a more saturated green selected, I'm getting more of a watercolor, more watered down version of that color. You can also scroll through the libraries using your left-right buttons. You may find something in here that looks really cool and is exactly what you need for your particular project. Let's scroll through and check out a few more. These strange dashed lines. These are artistic watercolor. Here's some borders, decorative borders, some frames, more borders, tons of borders. Let's go back to the brush library and look at maybe some vector packs. No, let's do our arrows. How about some pattern arrows? Because I think those are kind of cool. These are different colors, different styles. And depending on the thickness of your stroke, so if we wanted to make a much thicker arrow, like so, it's using these dots. And depending on the angle that I draw on, it's creating some pretty interesting effects. So notice as I've been clicking and trying all these different options, those options have been added to my brushes panel so that I can continue using them and work with them in this particular document. There's also an options menu up here where you can create new brushes, and we'll get to that a little bit later. You could also delete any brushes by dragging them to the trash icon, or create your own new brushes, and again, we'll talk about that in a few minutes. Let's clear the stage here, and we'll talk for a minute about the blob brush. The blob brush is a fairly new tool that allows you to draw sort of like these compound shapes, and I'm just going to squiggly swirl around, and then you'll notice what it looks like when I release my mouse. So it's a single shape. So even though it looks like this should have a path on it, it actually doesn't. That's all fill, even though it looks like it should be a line. So for that matter, we can add a stroke to this, like so. And now you can still see it's a solid shape that has a stroke and a fill. And if we select it and continue drawing with that blob brush, we're actually created a new path separate from it. See if we can get right on top of it. Now it's not going to let us add to it because the properties are different for my new selected stroke. If we remove the stroke, however, we should be able to continue adding to it with the blob brush. Yes, like so. Now the brush stroke with the blob brush is really handy for creating artistic effects like this. So what I've done is I've created the vase as separate line art on its own locked layer. And then with layer 1 selected, we can use the blob brush to paint behind those shapes. So we could choose a fill of our choosing. So let's try and use some blues and greens and stuff. Grab our blob brush, and then we can just paint. And I always thought it was nice the way it looks when sometimes color extends beyond the line work. Let's choose another color here. We'll go a little bit green, and then we could do this part here, like so. So I don't even really have to worry about the shapes. As long as some of the shapes touch, it'll create a single shape. So if you look at it with the selection tool, each one of these is its own solid shape. And you couldn't really do that with a regular brush tool. So this is a really fantastic tool to play around with. Okay, again, let's now choose some red. So we could do like red roses, pinkish roses. And I'm just going to squiggle around here like so. And now I can either grab a lighter color or a darker color to add some highlight effects. Let's go and do a slightly darker color. I'll just adjust it down with the CMYK sliders. And then I could come in here and just add a little bit of sort of a shadow effect. And I could even go back in and do sort of a lighten effect if I wanted to, for that matter. So let's do a much lighter pink. And we could go on the opposite side, like so, to really give a little bit of dimensionality to these shapes. So you could play around to your heart's content. Again, so it's the line art is separate from the artwork. We could even use the blob brush to paint in little leaves. You can increase or decrease the size of the brush head with your left, right bracket arrows. So I could create a little leaf here, another little leaf here, or undo. That was a little bit too blobby, like so. There's another little leaf. And we have our lovely bouquet, all made with the blob brush. Now, another tool that's new in CS6 is the width tool, and it's a really crazy, amazing tool. First, you'll draw your artwork, and then you'll select the path, or actually, I don't even think you necessarily need to select the path, but here it is, the width tool, and it's a funny looking little tool, and it's grouped with some other tools that can modify the look of your objects. So let's play around with this tool. What you'll do, you notice it has like this little curly Q on the end of the arrowhead. What you do is you'll click on a path and drag. And as you can see, what it does is it takes a regular uniform stroke and applies a width to it. So wherever you happen to click, it will put that as sort of the midpoint, the center point for the expansion. And then it will taper down to the before and after anchor point. Isn't that pretty amazing? So let's do this little piece right here, just clicking and dragging. And we'll do this guy right there. So it's recognizing sort of the breaks in the path and then allowing me to click and drag. You can have as many of these little points on a single path. So if I wanted to add another one to make this part even thicker, just clicking and dragging to do that. The paths themselves, those little wigglers, they can be moved up and down the path, closer or further away to its existing anchor point. And you can resize them just by clicking on their outer edges, like so. So you can have something taper into almost nothingness and then taper out back to its anchor point. Another thing that you can do, which is really fantastic, is you can isolate one or the other side of a path so you don't have to just uniformly drag it out. So if I wanted to make this guy's mustache fuller on top, I'll hold down my Alt or Option key while I click, and I'm just isolating one side of his path for his mustache. Bonjour. Then we could take this guy, grab it like this. So you can see that it really gives your artwork personality. So if I wanted to come back in here and maybe thin out this area here. Oop, I think I just grabbed his ear. Thin out right there. Like so. I can make it look like he has some hair. Isn't that fantastic? Or he's wearing a little beret. So this is a really amazing tool to play around with. So I encourage you to spend a lot of time practicing and playing around. So let me take this blob tool up at the top here and zoom in a little bit. And we'll talk about some of these other tools that are hidden underneath the width tool. There's something called the warp tool. And with the warp tool, you can modify the size of the brush head. But as I click and drag through the shape, you'll see how it's warping or manipulating the shape. So if you needed to just, bow something out and move it out just a little bit or move it in just a little bit, this would be a tool that you might be interested in working with. To modify its properties, just double click on it and the warp tool options dialog box comes open. Here you can set the width and height of the brush as well as the angle and the intensity. And if you are using a pen, you can specify whether or not to use that pressure. There's warp options such as detail and simplicity, and also whether or not you should show the brush size. And then if you change it, you could always come back here and press the reset button to have it reset to these defaults. Below the warp tool is something called the twirl tool, which does exactly that. It twirls. And with all of these tools, if you double click on the button in the toolbar, you can see a dialog box come up. So the twirl rate is at 40%. So if I didn't want to twirl quite as much, I could bring it down. Let's do something like -30. And maybe I want to decrease the width and height. So let's make it 80 and 80 and click OK. And now when I go to twirl, it's just not as drastic of a twirling. So depending on how you set this, you can create different effects. Now, if you click and hold down, you're just going to go into Crazy Spiral City, but that might be something that you really want to do. So that's how you would do it. So let's continue looking at some of these other tools. There's the pucker tool. So if we click here, we're sort of bringing everything in, like sucking on a lemon. Underneath that is the bloat tool, which is self-explanatory. A little goes a long way. You barely need to click. So for this one, you probably would want to modify the brush head and really maybe drag the intensity down somewhat so that it's not so drastic, so that you could just simply click a little bit here, a little bit there to fatten up a particular area. Underneath that is the scallop tool, and the scallop tool creates scalloped edges. I've never really personally been able to deal with this scallop tool successfully because it just seems to scallop in sort of this willy-nilly fashion and create this strange fringe that, I don't know, I've never seen anybody use this successfully. I would love to see someone show me an example of where they've used this to good effect. But anyway, it's there. Maybe I'm missing something. Underneath that is the crystallize tool. The crystallize tool will actually create almost like these weird crystally scalloped edges, which is pretty cool. I like that one. It reminds me of like Venus flytrap or one of those other plants that eats bugs. And then the last one under there is the wrinkle tool. And I think the wrinkle tool is also really handy because it can just give a slightly imperfect edge to a selection. And I like sort of that hand-drawn sensibility. Sometimes, smooth, perfect paths and curves are appealing, but other times you want to give something a little bit more of an organic feel. And that would be a tool that you would want to use. So let's shift over now, and we're going to talk about creating your own custom brushes. There are 5 different brush types now that you can use. There's the calligraphic brush, the bristle brush, which is fairly new, pattern brushes, art brushes, and scatter brushes. Let's take a look at the bristle brushes first. And actually, let's go back over here and grab our paintbrush tool, and we'll talk about those bristle brushes. Let's look in the library and bristle brush, bristle library. If you know how to paint with a regular canvas, these brushes would be particularly interesting to you. You can see that it has the brush shape as well as the brush size. So if you wanted to work with an angled brush like this, just select it. It will be added to your brushes panel, and then you can click and begin to paint. So you can get more realistic brush looks with these bristle brushes. Again, if you're used to painting, you can ink up your brushes. In this particular brush, it's more like a watercolor brush. But you can see how painting with these is much different. You have semi-transparency, a little bit of opacity, and you can really see the fibers in these brushes. You can create your own bristle brushes if you like. When you're ready to create a brush, you'll click on this button here, New Brush, and the New Brush dialog box comes open. Here you can specify the brush type, and you'll notice that Scatter and Art are deselected, and that's because you must select artwork before you click that button for those, and I'll show you that in just a second. So let's say we wanted to create a new bristle brush. This Bristle Brush Options dialog box comes open, and we can make all of the selections to create the brush to our specifications. So here's where we can choose the shape of our brush. So let's make a fan brush, and then we can choose the size in millimeters. So maybe I want to go really big, like let's do 7.0 millimeter. And then we can choose the length of the bristle, longer or shorter, and the length will determine the look. So if you're not really sure what percentage it should be, look at the preview, and that should give you a general idea. Your brush density, how many bristles are in there. So you might want to have more so you can really see the fibers. And the thickness just changes ever so slightly the look of it, fine to coarse. You have the opacity, so how clear it is versus how opaque it is. So 100% gives you fully opaque. So you'd probably want to go somewhere in here so you can actually see the brush strokes. And then the stiffness of the brush right here, flexible versus rigid. And when you have it the way you want it, give your brush a name. So I might call it Sue and click OK. That new brush here has been added to my brushes panel so that I can select it and begin painting at any time. So let's swap those and then get rid of the fill and then paint with my new brush that I just created. Like so. So that's bristle brushes. Now let's switch back over here and we'll talk about creating an art brush. With an art brush, you must select your artwork first. So here's an example of some work. Then you'll click on the new brush option and choose Art Brush and click OK. The Art Brush dialog box comes open and you could give your art brush a name. So I'll probably call all these Sue while I'm showing you here. And then you could choose the width, whether it's fixed. Now, none of these options are available because we're not using a pressure pen with a stylus or anything. But you could increase or decrease these options here, the minimum or the maximum. Let's just leave these at 100%. And then you have some brush scale options. So you can choose whether or not your brush will scale proportionately to the stroke, will be stretched to fit the entire stroke length, which is the default, or will stretch between guides. Whenever this option is selected, and this is pretty cool, if you were creating graphics like button graphics for the web, you could specify that you wanted some guides. So you can choose the direction of your guides. So in this case, I would probably want to bring this in like this and bring this guy in like that, so that while you're painting, you would paint in this direction. And if you wanted to increase this middle area, you would not ruin the integrity of the left or right side of this brush. So that middle area would just stretch to fit. This is good when you have artwork that has separate end looks than the middle point. So that's really handy. Once you choose your option here, you can also choose the colorization. So if you wanted to, you could tint it. So even though you have the original artwork color, you can choose to tint or tint and shade or even shift the hue. But I'm going to leave it off because I like the colors that I selected already. And then you could choose whether or not it should flip along the horizontal or the vertical axis or flipping across the path. I'm going to leave everything the way it is here and click OK. And then show you how to use this brush. So I've just created that brush. I'm going to deselect this on the artboard, and then I'm just going to paint with it. And you can see that depending on how far I click, I change the look of the brush. I'm going to undo those, and then we'll do one stroke so just we can have that as a reference point, like so. Now you can also work with other artwork, and I'll grab these guys here. We'll do the same thing. So new brush, new art brush, clicking OK. I'm just going to leave everything the same except for I'll call it Sue Bubbles. And now deselecting that, grabbing my paintbrush and painting. Oh, where's my bubbles? There we go. And painting with my bubbles. So you can see that I'm just painting and it's just sort of following the path and just dropping that shape onto the path. I'm going to undo these like so. And undo that guy as well. And we'll move on to talking about defining patterns for brushes. Now here I have 3 separate patterns. And with patterns, you can create different looks and feels that will go along a path. And these can be applied. Let's actually move that one away. These patterns can be applied to both open and closed paths. So I have a square shape and I have an open path here. And in fact, let's take a look at this diagram. Let me zoom out a little bit so we can see it. When you're creating artwork for a particular pattern, there are different parts of a pattern that you need to keep in mind. In fact, when you're creating your artwork, you can create up to 5 individual pieces of art for the different components that could go on a path. So I have them labeled here. There's the side or the midpoint of a path labeled with A. There's the outer part of a path. Then there's the inner part of a path, as well as the start and the end of a path. So you would create at least 3, the A, B, and the C. And if you wanted to have different end and start points for an open path, you can also create D and E. Let me show you how easy it is to create a pattern brush like this. Open up your swatches panel because we'll need to create patterns for each of these individual pieces of art. And you'll notice that I have them in the order so that they match this little diagram, and I will name them each A, B, C, D, and E so that they'll flow in the order that I want them to flow. So select your artwork, drag and drop it into the panel one at a time. And as you do that, you're creating individual patterns that can be applied to open or closed shapes, as well as to paths. Paths can support patterns if they're thick enough. And if you wanted to, you could rename these by double-clicking on the pattern to open up the Pattern Options dialog box and give these a name. So I'm just going to name them A, B, C, D, and E, like so. And then I can use these patterns to create a new brush. Let's go back to our Brushes panel, clicking on the button at the bottom to create a new brush, select Pattern Brush, click OK, and now we just need to map our pattern swatches to the individual pieces of these diagrams. And if you forget which one's which, just think of them as labeled A, B, C, D, and E. And also the little thumbnail below sort of gives you a hint as to where each of these individual pieces go. So selecting the first one, grabbing A. Looks like I didn't rename that last one, but that's okay. And then the second one for B, third for C, fourth for D, and fifth for what should be E. And again, you could change any of these options in here, clicking OK. And then your new pattern brush is added to the Brushes panel, which you could then select any existing path and apply. And that goes for both open and closed shapes. Now in this case, there is no end point or elbow points, so we're just getting the diamond all the way around. You could also paint with that selection with your brush tool, like so. I'm going to just select that and delete it. Now, there's other brush types that you might want to create. There's the regular calligraphic brush, and this will give you an opportunity to name your brush, and you can set the angle, you can set the roundness, like so. You can set the size, and that little preview window shows you what you're getting with each of these. Let me just do something like that. If you're using a pen tool, you can modify a fixed random pressure stylus wheel tilt, bearing, and rotation, as well as the variation. Click OK, and then you can begin to paint with that new brush. Just zap that guy. So now let's talk about the other brush type. We have scatter brushes. So for a scatter brush, you need to select your artwork first, clicking on the new button. In this case, we've covered calligraphic, we've covered art brush, we've talked about bristle and pattern, so this is the last one that I'd like to show you. So creating a scatter brush, We can give our scatter brush a name, and then we can modify the size. So you might want to play around with this. So if you want the scatter to be random, or the size to be random, or any of these things to be random, let's just do random for everything rather than spacing, because then it'll look a little more natural rather than organized. You can also play around with these sliders. So I'll just sort of adjust them willy-nilly here. And then this option here I think is important because you might want to have the rotation relative to the page so that the tops are always pointing to the top of the page and the bottoms are always pointing to the bottom of the page. Or what I actually prefer, which is relative to path, so that the scatter will sort of flow with the shape and direction of the path. And then we'll click OK. And then there's our pattern brush. We could grab our brush and paint with that pattern. Oh, now notice that we're barely seeing any here, and that's because I probably increased with one of those options in the pattern brush, something like super huge. So let's go modify the brush, and this goes for anything that you create here. And I'm just going to put all these back to 100% so that we can see what's going on here. You can double click on any of your brushes to go back in and modify them at any time. It was probably that one, that 500% something, that was throwing these out of whack. And we can apply it to existing strokes or leave the strokes that were there before. I want to apply it to my existing strokes. Actually, let's remove them and we'll paint again. So making sure that that brush is selected and then painting like so. So you can see how they're scattering. And it's a really fun brush to play with. Now, there are a bunch of brush libraries that come free with Adobe Illustrator. Oops, that was one of my originals that I would like to encourage you to take a look at. So I wanted to show you the decorative brushes. So decorative scatter. Some of these are pretty cool. So there's some star, painting with the star. You could paint with this shape here. And notice that some of these have different scatters than others. So if you wanted to know more about any one brush, you could double click on it to add it to your brushes panel and then look at the settings. And this will help you determine how they got it to work the way it's working. And then if you really wanted to, you can make a note of those measurements and then apply it to your own artwork, which I think is really handy. Some of these brushes even include transparency. Now, if you find a brush that you think is really amazing and you want to be able to use it, but there's something about it that you would want to modify, you could drag it onto your artboard and then modify that as artwork. Go into isolation mode first, make a change. So maybe I want to make this green, but give it a stroke instead of a white stroke. We'll go back to our CMYK sliders and give it a yellow stroke and make that stroke thicker, like so. Going back out of isolation mode, then from that artwork, I can create a new brush, new scatter brush. And I'll just leave all the settings here. And then I can paint with that new brush. So you can use existing artwork. All of these brushes, libraries, are free for you to use as a starting point for your own artwork. So feel free to delve in there and start using them to create your own custom brushes.